Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we are on a book club episode with Joseph Thomas Minich, and he is going to be talking to us about his new book, Bulwarks of Unbelief, Atheism, and Divine Absence in a Secular Age, published by Lexham Press. So if you've listened to our show at any length of time and heard our book club episodes, you know that there's going to be a link to our show notes with that publisher, Lexham Press, and it'll take you right to this book so you can get it for yourself. Also, just read a couple brief endorsements based on some guests that we've had on our show personally that have written endorsements on even this book. Carl Trueman wrote the foreword, and we've had him on our show a couple times, and he says this about the book. This is an important book, both in its argument and its proposals, a significant contribution to recent conversations about modernity, faith, and what it means to be a human in a technological world. And then Michael Horton's been on our show a few times as well, and he says this: if you find Charles Taylor's analysis persuasive, I think you'll find Minich's even more so. So pretty great endorsements to set up this interview with Joseph Thomas Minich, and I will let Peter further introduce him today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Joseph Minich. I'm sure when he said Joseph Thomas Minich, he was like, "Oh my gosh, this is my mom calling me. This is not good." Is a teaching fellow with the Davenant Institute, which we're also sponsored by. He is the founding editor of Ad Fontes and editor of several volumes with the Davenant Press. Thanks for coming on our show, Dr. Minich.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. What's it feel being compared to the great Charles Taylor and saying this is a better book than Charles Taylor's?
I feel well, it's flattering, I suppose, that it makes me want to hide a little bit. Like, oh man, I don't know if I want to be compared to Charles Taylor. My goodness, that's the big guns.
Yeah.
I feel more like, I feel more derivative of Taylor than like to be compared to him. But I suppose I won't. I suppose I won't reject the endorsement for Bookville's purposes.
If it comes from Horton,
it must be true. Exactly. I mean, hey, listen to Horton, not me.
That's which is funny too, because literally, as we're recording this on March 29th, I finished his Sources of the Self March 28th yesterday. Finished the last few pages of it, and I've read Secular Age. It was fun and interesting reading Sources of the Self, which is Charles Taylor, and Bulwarks of Unbelief at the same time, and seeing the same strands run through the book. I was like, this is really, really fun.
Oh, cool.
This is really cool.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. Yeah.
It was a fun thing to do. Maybe to start off with, let our listeners know a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, so I raised kind of in the, I suppose you could say, the Dallas area. I was born in California, actually, so I suppose in my deep the LA area. But I was gone pretty young, so I've always just said that I think I'm a Californian at heart. But I was raised in Texas. Kind of a homeschooling family, sort of in the culture wars in the 90s, so so part of my story, gotcha. I suppose, is being an inquiring young person in that context and watching a lot of my fellows grow up. And there's a lot of cases where a lot of my friends grew up and lost their faith. And so I think a lot of my intellectual project, ever since I was in an undergrad at Catholic, I wound up moving to or outside of Washington, D.C., in the Maryland area. My wife's from there, so we moved there to marry her. But effectively, when I was at Catholic U there for my undergrad, a lot of my project became really thinking through why people lose their faith, and then really struggling myself with, the questions I had and what, wanting to come to a more assured and stable relationship to the Christian Orthodox project. And I guess that more or less, even through seminary, I was at RTS in the Virginia, D.C. area. I think even through seminary, that really shaped a lot of just my focus, I suppose. And so by the time I was looking at PhD work after having read Taylor's Secular Age, I really wanted to get more into, I think just naturally, in a sense, my head began to be in the space of what is it about our context, kind of our world that renders our questions.
It's like the Taylor gateway into all these questions.
So it's definitely a post-Taylor project. He was very deeply influential on me when I read for about a year. I led a reading group through Secular Age in the Maryland area, and that really helped kind of shape the I guess in academic terms, the question frame, the framing of the question, which became my project, you might say. And so since then, I've been working mostly on. I wrote this little book, and I've worked with the Davenant Institute. I should add that a lot of my publication and the ability to sort of throw these thoughts out loud came through partnership with the Davenant Institute, and so they published my little book, Enduring Divine Absence, which was sort of the first attempt for me to work through these questions, and then this is really the more robust attempt to work through very similar questions. And then right now I'm in the process right now of writing a book that's trying to kind of expand this rhetorical voice into sort of the whole Christian faith, rather than just taking how does modernity influence our relationship to the question of God singularly, sort of dovetailing or extending what I tried to do in the last chapter of the book. How does modernity and how do all these forces impact the way that we look at all of the particulars of the Christian faith? And so the next book, I'm hoping, will be a sort of philosophical guided tour of the Christian faith for modern people, something like that.
Cool.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Getting into my first question, we hinted at this, the title of the book and where it came from. So what's some of the context behind the title, Bulwarks of Unbelief? So I said that clearly for the audience so they can see the difference. Bulwarks of Unbelief, and how it's contrasted with the phrase that Charles Taylor coined, bulwarks of belief, and also initial connections to Herman Bavinck that you immediately introduce in your book.
Yeah, so bulwarks of belief and bulwarks of unbelief. So Taylor, certainly the title Bulwarks of Unbelief is just riffing on Taylor's Bulwarks of Belief very intentionally. So early in Secular Age, for those who've read it, Taylor has this, I think it's the name of the chapter, actually, Bulwarks of Belief. If I recall, it's the title of a chapter. And it's a fairly extensive chapter. And effectively what Taylor's trying to do is to kind of paint a picture, not just intellectually, but sort of practically and existentially and cosmically, you might say, of, say, European civilization in the year 1500, something like that. And what he's trying to do in that section is say it would have been very hard, maybe even impossible, for somebody in this context, because of all of these features of their world and what that does to kind of our belief formations. It would have been very difficult for somebody not to have what we would, by modern standards, call religious beliefs. And so in a sense, what Taylor's whole project is to say, how did we get from bulwarks of belief, a context in which it's very, very hard not to believe because of all of these reasons, again, not just intellectual, but material culture reasons, to a time when even the most fervent believer experiences their belief to be kind of one option among many at a kind of visceral cultural level. You feel the relativization of that, you might say. And so Bulwarks of Unbelief is an attempt to kind of extend Taylor's analysis and say, I'm in a sense just reversing the metaphor, right? It would be very difficult, you might say, in our context, maybe unbelief is overstating it. We can overcome unbelief, but it would be very difficult in our context not to struggle with it in the sense that Taylor's talking about. In other words, it'd be very difficult in our context, similarly, because of intellectual but also material factors, not to be shoved into the question of how can I know this? Why do I believe this? Am I certain that this is the right option versus that option, intellectually and culturally and morally and all those sorts of things? There's conditions, background noises, you might say, that render it almost inevitable that those kinds of questions are going to arise kind of spontaneously in our soul. And so, I'm kind of just playing with that. Bavinck comes up because I'm using him because I'm trying to identify in the book a crucial period where I think the plausibility structures change a bit. And Bavinck kind of straddles the period, because Bavinck is born in 1854, he dies in 1921, and it really is those years where that Bavinck lives, where I think you see, in some ways, the critical, crucial change that really renders atheism implausible. Nevertheless, what's fascinating is that Bavinck, at least in the dogmatics, still speaks at that stage, late 19th, early 20th century, of atheism as highly, highly implausible. Now, I say in a footnote...
And people wouldn't have disagreed with him back then, too.
Say that again?
And people wouldn't have disagreed with him back in the 19th century.
I will say that when I initially wrote the book, I didn't have access at that time to Eglinton's biography of Bavinck that just came out. And Eglinton does show that Bavinck treats atheism as in a more robust way than I was aware of when I wrote this text. Nevertheless, the way he rhetorically presents atheism, I try to caveat this in a footnote after reading Eglinton. The footnote made it into this published edition, but not the dissertation. But effectively, what I try to say in the footnote is, nevertheless, Bavinck can bank on the fact that he can just say out loud in the dogmatics, pretty much nobody's really a materialist and takes it that seriously, and bank that most readers will just say, yeah, that's true. Even though, in a sense, that begins to change, I think, mostly after Bavinck. I think he can see it coming. It changes mostly after him. But yeah, he's sort of brought in as a representative of somebody that's straddling two worlds, and in some sense notices it and feels it, and then the analysis after that is really sort of post Bavinck. Yeah.
So you're not disagreeing with Charles Taylor's book. You're just updating the context.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's a good question. There are some disagreements between me and Taylor. I say that me and Taylor.
We'll get into some of those.
There's some disagreements. I would say they tend to be a bit milder. Certainly, the way I'm framing the question, though, is deeply designed by him. And I think there might be a question forthcoming where I'll sort of nail down where I really quote depart from him, you might say.
Totally, yeah. And so you've already kind of hinted at this, and this is in the title too. One of the biggest themes, if not the biggest theme, and it's kind of a strand that goes through the book, is the perceived, and I'll kind of underline, perceived divine absence of God. And so we'll get into various factors at play, but can you describe what you mean by divine absence? Some people are like, well, God's not absent. So what do you mean by divine absence, and what this doesn't
That's
mean?
a good question, and you've already, and I really appreciate this because this is just constantly missed. You've really done the right thing in underlining that word perceived. Really, the divine absence, when I talk about divine absence, I'm not talking about God actually being absent, or I'm not even talking about God not being evident in some way. I'm really talking about the human perception that it is difficult to feel persuaded of God's existence. Why is it? Here's one way of putting it. And why is it that we all, here's what I'll do. I remember, I've told this story many times, but I remember listening to an interview of a young woman at a kind of an agnostic camp, and it was sort of, there's Bible camp and now there's agnostic camp because it's the 2000s. So it was junior higher is at agnostic camp, and it's kind of an NPR thing. They're interviewing her and giving her a microphone, and they give her a chance to sort of present one of her barbs. And she says something this is a 13, 14-year-old girl, and she says something to the effect of, why doesn't God just pull the clouds back every day and say, here I am, and then go away? Because if he did that, there'd be no atheists. And that sounds silly, but I remember driving in my car on the way to work and feeling a little bit the sting of that arrow. Why doesn't God make himself so clear that nobody could even functionally deny him? And I think there's all sorts of good answers to that question, but it's a question we feel the pain of a little bit. There's something intuitively in us that says yeah, I can have arguments for God's existence, the 5 proofs and this sort of thing, and there's all sorts of good arguments for God's existence, and yet there's this lingering gap of felt hold on reality in me when I just terminate in those arguments. Why is it that it feels like, why is it that I can almost even imagine the universe this way if it just can't be that way? What's the pull of that on me? And so, it's really very much a problem of perception. It's very much a sense that God could be more obvious than he is in some way. And a lot of, I think, what the antidote to that winds up being is, in a sense, reframing that whole question. Nevertheless, we're moving through the question because it's how it naturally presents itself to us. God could be more here, it would seem, than he is in some relevant way that would help us epistemically. Something like that.
It's not, so it's what you're saying is it's a felt perception, not an actual perception, not something that they like kind of come to intellectually, but it's like I don't feel like he's here. He's not a tangible presence to me, or
and in a sense it's in contrast, when I talk about divine absence in that context, it's in contrast to that sense that, like, you can imagine somebody, and I think we'll get into this maybe a little more in a bit, but like you can imagine somebody in the past just really sensing that the world was kind of a collection of agencies that terminate in a grounding agent. And so it's not just that the arguments work, it's that reality seems like and feels like something that is just an agentic personal thing. And so, like, God as kind of the background explainer of a deeply personally felt world just kind of viscerally makes sense. That connection happens very intuitively, whereas I think what we have is an experience of a world and of persons that has actually evaporated some of those textures, and God seen in the mirror of those textures can appear superfluous, kind of like the exception to the rule almost, if that makes any sense.
Totally, yeah.
Sounds kind of like they're having a hard time recognizing general revelation because they don't have that category. And it's general revelation to them is just purely visual and materialistic. And sounds like kind of some things you're hinting at. And I also think, like, I keep being reminded of Romans 1 talking about how the truth is suppressed. It's not that all human beings are made in the image of God, and we actually suppress the truth by not believing, in God.
Yeah. And that's a really good comment, because part of what it helps is to sort of narrow in the focus, because part of what I want to focus on is, like, even for those who believe in general revelation. And I think this is the sort of thing here is, like, even if we have that category notionally and it helps us explain the world, we can still viscerally, maybe one way of putting it, Nick, would be to say, even if we believe in general revelation, do we experience general revelation as a revelation? We can know it, exegete it, kind of make arguments about it, put it all on our spreadsheet. But then when I walk outside, is it actually viscerally true to me that God himself is communicating and has splayed it? Does my body, you might even say, react to the splaying of God on the canvas of creation? And I think a lot of us too easily walk around with, like, the theological categories, but there's a gap between that kind of fullness of existential obviousness of those categories. And so we constantly have to kind of remind ourselves, oh yeah, general revelation. Oh yeah, that is God revealing himself. As opposed to that just being super obvious, like by default, in a sense, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, what you're not saying, and this is maybe helpful to the next question too, we're not saying this is a Christian, non-Christian contrast. It was an assumed thing until it was, we'll get to it, was not an assumed thing. And how did that not assumed thing for both Christians and non-Christians come about, where like there's a possibility with this, and so you are disconnected from this this perceived
that's exactly right. And so one of the basic things I'm trying to do in this book, and actually in the one I'm writing right now, is to sort of start with where believers and unbelievers share in common, which is a little, kind of weird. It's like we both struggle with, we land different places, and that's where belief and unbelief especially come in. But we can feel the sting sort of communally because we share the same world. I mean, we live in the same place. And so, their problems are our problems are their problems in some relevant sense that generates these questions. Yeah.
Totally. Sure. Okay. So on to my next question. Who are some of the major characters? I know we brought up Bavinck and Charles Taylor, but also some philosophers, cultural commentators, sociologists, theologians, etc., that you have that you interact with in this book. Briefly, how did, and maybe not limited to just this book, if you have someone else that's helped influence you, briefly, how did they either advance the plausibility of atheism or push against it? And so, that just kind of, especially within the post-Darwinian age.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when I first heard that question, I had to really think, because like the book has it just has so many, it comes from a bunch of, there's all these names in it, and you have to really think, like, who are the people that for whatever reason they just kind of linger back there, and you almost retrospectively realize when you're done with a project like this, who really, to use the metaphor of Inception, who incepted me in the deepest way. And some of those names are just people nobody would know because they don't write anything. It's just personal mentors, right? That's a huge part of this project, has just been conversations with friends and intellectual communities. And so that's been a really rich part of in God's mercy, of my story. As I was reflecting on that question, though, the names I guess I'd come up with are, Martin Heidegger's essay on technology was huge for me. Marx's, we'll talk about Marx in a bit, I think, but Marx's little, just that little 10 pages he writes on alienation was a big deal for me. Richard Sennett writes on craft and labor and cities and all these sorts of things. Richard Sennett was a kind of helpful phenomenologist of labor, you might say, something like that. I think he was fairly influential. At a sociological level, I'd say one name I retrospectively, I think, realized. I don't use him a lot in the text, but I can see that Anthony Giddens, his little book, The Consequences of Modernity, it's only 200 pages long, maybe. I think his analysis of the way in which modernity has something to do with the mediation of what is very far away in a local context to what is local. This odd stretching of not just access to others' places, but the idea that events going on very, very far away have a deep impact now on the local sphere, whereas previous locals were just local. And all of the kind of social and existential impact that has. Anthony Giddens, I think, I again retrospectively realize his impact. But if I were just to name a name, interestingly, I would just say skip my book and go read Lewis. Lewis has just more and more, and in fact, since the book, has deeply impacted me. And one of the most embarrassing things, actually, is that after I wrote this book, I found Lewis, as Lewis is wont to do, making almost exactly my same argument, and I'd never read it before until a couple of years ago. But in Miracles, I think it's in chapter 6 I think it's a chapter of Red Herrings. He has this incredible quote on what's going on with God and naturalism and modernity, and in just 2 pages, he effectively, it could have been my abstract, for my dissertation. And it was like, oh my God. So Lewis has definitely deeply, deeply just shaped my imagination, my categories. Bavinck, obviously, but we're kind of thinking post-Bavinck here. Bavinck and Lewis.
And you end with Lewis in the book, too.
Yes. So Lewis is just all over my imagination. And I think largely because Lewis, it is because of him and what an incredible communicator he is. Lewis, I think, in ways that, in fact, not everybody even realizes, is just such a deep consolidator of the Christian tradition for modern people. And he doesn't have any of he doesn't go out of his way to like show you where he's getting it all from. He just kind of pure distillate throws it at you in a pretty accessible way. And I guess I've just been deeply incepted by all of him. as much as I've read of him, and that's you can feel that in the text, I think. Yeah.
In case people aren't clear which Lewis you're talking to.
CS, as in Clyde Staples.
Just to make sure that
Jack.
just to make
right.
sure. Yeah.
That's right. Fair enough. That's a good point. Yes.
And I have a quick kind of like not mediating but bridging question, just for definition's sake, and I'll bring it up a little bit later, and just because I'm curious, and I think our audience might be curious too. When we talk about phenomenology, because that shows up quite a bit in the book, as well as other terms, what does that mean? Because I know Hegel uses it, Heidegger uses it, Kant uses it. All these guys use what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, because everybody talks about the phenomena, that sort of thing. Phenomenology, is really just like I think the real simple and I'm even using a pretty loose definition in the book, in a sense, even though the people I studied with were the real phenomenologists in some sense. But effectively, this study of appearances, it's like how do realities, it's in a sense asking not just the question, what is a thing, what is that building, what is that person, but recognizes that our access point to even getting at a question like that is how they manifest to us or how they appear to us. So the study of phenomenality, in a sense, is the study of, you might say, appearances. That's a first gesture, is to say something like study of appearances, but it's not necessarily appearances just in the visual sphere. You could speak about a phenomenology of sound, a phenomenology of, kind of anything, meaning what are kind of the most immediate tactile, and here's a key here's a key aspect, I think, of the phenomenological tradition, kind of precognitive interpretive grappling with things as they manifest themselves to us. And so it's, we don't just encounter objects and things in the world as just building, tree, sign. We bring a whole world of interpretation to those things, and those things interact with us in that world of interpretation. And so you're always, not that there's not a thing out there, and not that there's such a thing as good and bad interpretation and all that sort of thing, but it's really just trying to get at the reality that humans encounter the world always as a world of meaning with which they're kind of co-negotiating. And that is mostly, or at least largely, at a fairly precognitive and tacit level that you can nevertheless bring to conscious awareness. And so, something like that. So the way that's working out in the book is to sort of say, how do all of these technological and labor forces, you might say, deeply shape, in a sense, the way, what it feels like, you might say, to walk around outside and be alive and live in a community. So that's not quite getting at what is a community, what is a person, what is all that stuff. But what is it like to be with all of those things and those forces, and therefore how does that shape what becomes plausible and implausible to us?
Gotcha. I bring that up because I think that's going to bridge into this next question. And so I'll bring up two people. I'll ask questions sequentially. And two, one is Charles Taylor, which we've already talked about a little bit, which you build a lot of your work off of, which is obvious in this space. And then another one's Karl Marx, but you bring him up in a different way than I think people are expecting you to bring him up. So I'll start with Taylor. You build a lot on secular age, sources of the self, and modern social imaginaries, which kind of bridges into the phenomenology aspect as well. And you agree with him for the most part. Obviously, I think he's hard not to agree with, but you part with him in a few ways. And it's not like a disagreement, but you just kind of move in a slightly different direction. Can you describe how you engage with Taylor in this book?
So Taylor... Well, what Taylor's trying to do, in a sense, is, there's all these narratives of modernity out there. Taylor broadens our scope. We look at modernity in a much bigger scope. But so Taylor does two things with the narrative of modernity. On the one hand, he reaches back much further to help us understand the modern world. But then when he gets to kind of the key moment that we're all waiting for, when like belief in God really does become hard for a critical mass of people, just to put it that way, Taylor recognizes that crucial shift is mostly in the 19th century. what we call modernity and secularization and all those things, you can tell a backstory to it, but kind of the crucial catalyst moments are actually more recent than we might think. You might say, we became, at what point did we begin to speak about ourselves as secular and disenchanted and, these sorts of things? When did we talk that way about ourselves? And actually, that's a fairly good way of measuring when we became those things. So what I do with Taylor is, for Taylor, the clear moment is when belief in God becomes a threat. This is the way he kind of frames the key moment. When belief in God becomes a threat to the modern moral order. Not just like something we have to make sure can somehow be integrated or maybe is superfluous, but when it's seen as actually a threat to the modern moral order, you begin to see some kind of vociferous unbelief, like actual rejection of God. And I think there's some truth in that, and even now you can see that a lot of atheism, a lot of agnosticism is fueled by moral constraints and that sort of thing, or moral outrage and that sort of thing. But it's unclear to me why God had to become a problem on Taylor's analysis. In other words, why wasn't it Christianity specifically or a creedal tradition specifically? Why, none of that quite gets to me why materialism, kind of crass, just even being able to imagine crass materialism, it's unclear to me how that gets us all the way there. And so what I'm trying to do in my book on one part is just kind of fill out the narrative. Taylor has kind of brought the plane in for a landing as a sort, and it's like I'm trying to put that last ramp in, maybe for me, at least in my analysis.
Sure.
How did the drastic shifting world of labor systems and technology really deeply shape us, such that not only could God be perceived as a moral problem or something like that, but also that he just becomes an implausible explanatory force for anything, kind of within that same period. And so what I'm trying to do is really trying to narrow it down and say, how does God himself actually become implausible? Not just sort of possibly against the project, but deeply implausible in some way, or at least in people, again, we're going back to felt to be implausible, perception, that sort of thing.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a narrowing of Taylor's argument to get in that material culture angle, you might say, in the 19th, 20th centuries. I think implicitly in what I'm extending in my work right now is that I'm trying to extend Taylor's analysis also in a forthcoming book. Sort of what I'm doing is looking at Taylor as taking what Taylor does with religion and then wanting to see it with everything. So Taylor's argument, you might say, is modernity is this moment where our beliefs become one option among a sea of options. And he's focused on religious beliefs. I think it would be interesting to say, can that analysis also be extended to kind of everything? Is it just our beliefs that are an option, or is it cultural mores? Is it our context? And we might even say in our context, as modernity has grown, you can say, or our genders,
totally.
All these sorts of things in it. So in the new book, I'm my working definition of modernity that's implicit in this book. This book is sort of where I worked it out, and now it's just a pithy formula. So my pithy formula is modernity is the simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. And so religion.
that's quite
thanks, brother. Pass it on, everybody. But don't publish on it before I do. No, it's fine. You go ahead. I don't care. Simultaneous global renegotiation of all human custom. Religion, of course, what we call religion, of course, being a massive integral piece of that. Yeah. But that's effectively where I'm trying to move a little bit beyond Taylor.
Okay, and then. Before Nick asks his next question, and to preface this, we're not agreeing with everything Mark said. We're not kind of lionizing him and kind of lifting him up on the pedestal. But you do have a really fascinating section on his treatment on the distance between the laborers, the person who works, and the product that they create, and how this relates in a broader sense to the distancing between humans and nature. So can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, it's really funny because Before my interest, and it's a mild interest really, but my interest in Marx really didn't, I went to a university, a state school, and, there's lots of, kind of critical theory and all that sort of stuff there. But I didn't read Marx in a graduate program. It was actually through Christopher Lasch, who's conservative, kind of, traditional credentials are kind of unquestionable. He's a big name in conservative intellectual culture.
Oh yeah, huge name.
But his book, The True and Only Heaven, Progress and Its Critics, has this fascinating section, as I recall, that depicts kind of like Southern agriculturalists making a lot of the same comments and even receiving favorably some of the comments of Marx. These are not who you think of when you think of Marx, but it's because of the theme of...
You don't think of Southern laborers and Marx together.
It's just because of the theme of alienation from labor. Like, Marx's solutions to these observations are not any solution I have an interest in, and they can be as reductive of the human as the very things he's responding to. But I think it's actually a fairly traditional conservative commonplace at this point. I've since read more about this. A fairly conservative commonplace to want to see a connection, a couple of things, to want to see a connection between people and place. Place is a very significant aspect of human life and community. And to see a connection as it pertains to labor between my aptitude and my activity, and then my activity in the community and my activity in my life. Now, this is a fallen world. That's not always going to occur. Labor can mean monotonous. Yeah. Sometimes you just got to go get a job to provide for your family, all those sorts of things. So all that aside, nevertheless, most human traditions, I mean, you can see this in most religious traditions, when they're writing down their kind of natural law, how should labor work, sort of when they're approaching it, at that level. Most religious and human traditions, and Christian tradition is not only not an exception, it really is quite an exemplar in this. They recognize that God has given each of us gifts. We're kind of meant to plug into the social organism in some way through those gifts. That gives us meaning and dignity. We're seen by others, and we see others seeing us, and that's kind of how the algorithm works, you might say. And that labor, this is really key in Marx, that labor for most people in history has been immediately for life. Not for this thing called wages that then I go use to make life. So, like, even if planting crops is annoying, and even if the locust eating them is annoying and it's not fun to do all of these things, it's nevertheless extremely clear to me exactly what I'm doing and why. I'm putting food in the ground to live. The meaningfulness of it is just absolutely immediate. And Marx is, in a sense, identifying that we get alienated a bit from the immediacy of that meaning in our work, because now work takes on the character of go do this abstract task whose relationship to the set of tasks you don't fully understand, right? You just kind of do it because it gets you a paycheck, which enables me to go buy food. That's sort of modern labor, or a lot of labor. So there's that cutting off, and because of that as well, you're also cut off a bit from the community. For us, we get in an automobile, we go to a different location, something like that. But you're not necessarily hooking up into the community by virtue of your gifts. You still can, but a lot of your interaction in the community is hooking up to the community by virtue of your kind of abstract labor power, and you also become a very replaceable part in most of those labor systems. And so in all these ways, and we could talk about that in a bunch of ways, in all these ways, there's just something about the way that we've organized our labor, and this is really the analysis, that cuts off the human from what would have been historically very ordinary sites of meaning and social relationship and community. And that does something, effectively what I'm trying to do in the book is to say that does something to the way we interpret reality. What reality feels like in the mirror of somebody who does this 10 hours a day is going to be different than what reality feels like before we even get to ideas for somebody who lives a very different kind of life, 10 hours, for their 10 hours a day or whatever. And so that's effectively what I'm using Marx. It's sort of a passing, talk about him for 5 pages and move on just to get that one little bit. I'm sure I'll get in trouble for it, though,
Yeah.
with less gracious people than yourself, Peter.
No, it was just I thought it was a really helpful, again, for all the critique we can land on Marx, rightfully so. It was a helpful bridge that concretized, for me at least, the distance that we now feel from nature, and then that again concretizing itself in our perceived distance from God. Where, like you said, if you're growing crops, this you yourself are growing the crops. You see what you're growing, and that directly benefits you and your family because you know that's what you're making it for. Versus in the you can say the industrialized labor force is it's this abstract thing, so you're further pulled away from the product that you're actually making, and it's for somebody else that you're not actually you're not receiving the benefits from. You're getting the wages and stuff, and everyone's doing that. It's not that creates perceived distance per se, but it's this aggregated effects on top of itself. The more spheres that we're distanced from, that we feel this distanciation in total from nature, and we don't engage with it, quote unquote, as much as we had before.
Right. Yep. I think that's just right.
Yeah. Before my next question, I know this is a little change of gears, not off topic, but the philosophical aspect of this kind of conversation in your book, whatnot. There's a quote I've heard that makes a lot of sense based on this conversation, and I'm going to paraphrase it, of course. But the history of philosophy went from wonder to doubt, and I feel like that kind of helped me when I heard that a while ago, and then I read your book and having this conversation. It kind of helps with the history of the philosophy, knowing how it's gone from, modernity at one point, how people were perceiving philosophy and wonder, and now it's more of modernity is more of a doubt kind of starting place.
Yeah, I think that's right. That there's a first. I'm trying to. I don't know if I'll keep using this phrase, but there's almost like a primal first cynicism. I think in modern, and again, this isn't just an idea. It's a way of approaching reality where it's like first reality might be meaningful or not meaningful, and now I go through the process of kind of trying to get arguments that bring meaning back, kind of through my head into the canvas that I'm looking at. And I like the way you put that. What wonder does, wonder has this immediacy. It's just like the displaying of God in the canvas of creation is just there. And I think that's great that what you have, and I think that's absolutely right, Nick. What you have in a lot of the tradition, the Christian tradition, really just the human tradition in a lot of ways, but I think the Christian tradition makes this very, very rich. What you have is just this immediate sense that the world and the mind and the soul are just made for each other. The lights are on, and the world is smashing into me, and that's always already God communicating with me. That's always already very deeply the signature and the trace of a person. I think the Reformed and Reformational account of vocation and divine providence especially do this for us because it encourages us to look not only at the kind of things that are made, but also the very textures of our lives and the movements within it entirely as personal, but not... And again, this is what I always want to get back to in the book, not just believing that. It's not just I can see because there's a person up there and because on the spreadsheet that means everything's personal, etc. But really reattuning ourselves to the world in such a way that dimension just kind of immediately manifests to us, you might say. And in a sense, that's what I'm trying to imagine is, I think what you said is just right, Nick. It's like we almost by default start outside of a world of meaning and get ourselves back there through argument. And that is already to fail to begin in wonder and to start in doubt tacitly, even if we don't call it that.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in chapters 2 and 3, and I'm surprised we haven't even gotten to this point in the conversation because it's a really meaty core part of your book talking about technoculture.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and we're just now getting to it, but no, yeah, we're getting to it. So chapters 2 and 3 in the middle of your book really talk about the rise and dominance of technoculture. How did the scientific revolution, the rapid increase in technology, and our distance from the natural world We all know that these days with the computer age and digital. Distance from the natural world, nature equaling wild and untamed, perpetuate both our feeling of control over the environment and our feeling that God is less necessary now. Out of sight, out of mind a little bit. Maybe technology is so great that we're depending on ourselves. We're like, look what we can do on our own. Maybe religion and God seems kind of primitive or something. So we know this is a huge question, but be as precise as you can.
Yeah,
As a long question. Let me know if I can.
I think one of the advantages of being done with your dissertation and then thinking about it and then trying to rewrite it is that you realize, oh, I could have said that in a couple paragraphs every now and again. Not in a book. Don't. Please buy it still, everybody.
These two chapters, they're like 140 pages. They're meaty, but they're really,
Thank
really
you.
good.
But right. I actually think we can be fairly succinct about this because I think the idea is just basically that if we can start with, I think answering by contrast helps. Again, I think if we look at what the lives of most humans have been, I think the experience of being alive for most humans, and many humans still today, is one in which you very consciously experience the world as a kind of collection of agencies around which I have to learn to navigate. That's true of the social world, that's true of the natural world, that's true of just the whole world. And so kind of in my labor, I'm participating in that world. That doesn't mean there's not injustice or misery or all sorts of things. That doesn't even mean I like God. It just means that God is very plausible because the world is a world full of agencies. I'm plugging into it by virtue of meaning and agency. And so it manifests both cosmically and socially as an actor to me. And I think God, sort of looking at you might say, to use the way a lot of people use this phrase these days, to look at what the ground of being, you might say, must be like. What's the ultimate? What does reality bottom out in? You might say, in the mirror of that universe, the idea that there's an agent-like thing all the way at the bottom just makes a lot of sense. Now, if I were writing the book now, I might have added that wouldn't necessarily for our ancestors meant, any kind of philosophical monotheism that could have bottomed out in a kind of paganism, right? I have since read de Lubac saying monotheism isn't natural for anybody. In agrarian societies, paganism is quite natural. In modern industrial societies, atheism is quite natural. And actually, it takes everybody a little bit of movement to get to, a more robust monotheism. So that was one side of it. Let me just, I actually wrote down some thoughts. Let me make sure that right. So contrast to God in the mirror of that. What I argue in the worlds, kind of the diverse worlds of labor and technology, is that in what the modern technologized world does is mediate the world to us in such a way that its interior agency is mostly suffocated. That is to say, the ways in which most people would have to move around the world and treat it like an agent around which I have to navigate, or I'll be in trouble because that tree is going to tell me, if you try to walk through me, you can't do it because I'm hard and I'm here, and that sort of thing. What technology enables us to do is say, well, yes, I can, because I can cut you down. And it's not just, there's nothing wrong with cutting down trees. I'm not trying to be that guy. But when you do that to all of your experiences, when my experience of light, day, night, walking, the ground, movement, transportation, food, etc., all the things that texture out, a living world and a living life, when all of that is mediated through a technological apparatus that somewhat suspends the agentic quality of the world and even of other persons, because now what happens in the social relationships, right? Well, I don't have to talk to you. I can hang up the phone. I don't have to text you back. And we have increasing ability to actually pull away from other people's agency as well. And then you add the labor component to that even, so you might say the agency of the world in the mirror of modern technology is silenced a bit. But then you might add in the side of modern labor, the agency of the individual actor is likewise silenced. So you talk to a lot of people in modern labor systems, and the way they feel, we have all these books written about identity crises for people in their jobs, right? And part of the reason for that is that they feel like cogs in a machine, that will even talk about themselves. I think a lot of us use this kind of language of like almost feeling like a passenger in your own life, right? I'm not an actor. Now I'm working 50 hours a week and I'm using all of this energy, but I feel kind of like a passenger in the train. I don't really know. This is not a thing I'm actually it's not necessarily my project that I want to do. I just need to make money. And so your own agency then is suspended a bit. It's not experienced in its full natural sense. And then the feedback loop, in a sense, between the agency of others and the agency of oneself. And it's through that engagement with others that our own sense of agency develops. What I think happens is the agentic personal quality, you might say, of our lived experience begins to slowly evaporate in a social way, in a lived experienced way, that sort of thing. And God, you might say, what's the most basic thing about reality looked at through the mirror of that kind of experience of the world? Well, an agentlessness all the way down can kind of make visceral existential sense. It never makes intellectual sense, and I want to say that. There's always arguments for the existence of God, and in fact, I think those become especially important for people like us. We need them perhaps more than anybody else. So I don't dismiss apologetics or the use of those arguments. Nevertheless, what we can experience ourselves, as doing when we engage the arguments, is that we don't feel like necessarily the world is one that's meaning all the way down, and the arguments then come in to sort of remind us, reattune our minds at least to some aspect of reality that's not quite as visceral to us. And what I'm trying to do in the book is then go on, and again in the next writing project, is to go on and then say, how do we not just we need the arguments, they're very important for us especially, but then how do we kind of reattune the whole self? And what might it even mean to say, what does it look like to begin to reattune a whole culture, to plug back into, to order itself in such a way that those aspects of reality which are kind of suspended for us are more viscerally manifested? I think that would do a lot to the question of God for modern people.
That's good. I kind of want to, I was jotting some notes based on that and seeing if I'm on the same page. So I'm putting this totally in my layperson filtered response.
It's probably the better way to say it. Don't worry.
But I could definitely mess it up. So we'll see. Please help me out with this. So is it kind of like saying we know the natural world and nature is God's direct creation, right?
Yep.
The world as it is from God's direct creation, but technology is man's is a created thing from created beings. So God made things to make things. Yep. So and technology is not directly from the natural world. It's not directly from the Creator. It's God made men and men made technology. Not to say technology is bad or anything, but it's more. It's more, I guess, unnatural. It's not, in a way, it's kind of like a little farther from direct natural world, direct general revelation, that kind of thing. So it's easier to slip into idolization of something that we made versus reflecting on something God directly made. I'll stop there before. I think that's definitely true.
I think that is effectively to think of it to the extent. So technology has always been around. Technology is good and great. We love it. Kip, yes, I love technology. For those who know the reference,
and God uses technology.
Yes,
we're using it right now on the podcast.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, technology is a great thing, and I'm actually really glad you brought that up, Nick, because I think what you're saying is just right. That what happens is the ubiquity of technology. That is to say, there's very few things. Here we are talking over Zoom, right? There's very few places now where we don't experience other people in the natural world as deeply shaped and filtered a little bit through technological artifice. And the question is, what does that do to us? And it's never technology. And I try to say this many times in the book. I'm never focused on technology in the abstract. It's a good thing, or in principle, a good thing. It's really technology is used by human decisions. And I think this is really crucial, because sometimes when people write about technology, you can get the impression that technology is the actor. It's rather human. Humans are always, in some sense, in my judgment, or I try to make it in my narrative, it's always humans that are the actors by means of technology, and the way we're acting on each other and to each other through these media are ways that I think are suspending the agency of the world and of ourselves. And there, of course, you could an analysis, and again, this is not as much in the book as it will be in the coming book. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn this into a commercial. But
no, go for it.
Effectively, what I'm going to I self-edit myself so much that sometimes I lose my train of thought. I remember what I was going to say. The technology, as I'll be focusing on it, and the new book is going to be making the point that it's also kind of Lewis will talk about some men and other men, right? What we call man's control of nature is really some men's control of other men with nature as its instrument. That's Lewis's big formula in The Abolition of Man. He fleshes that out in That Hideous Strength. And so even in the analysis of this book, I think if I were to rewrite it, one of the things I would probably sprinkle here and there is to say, this world also is, it's not just these systems in the abstract. I do say that, but I want to add back in people, human beings are making decisions. Human beings have made decisions, in a sense, that have ordered their world this way. And that has deeply shaped how they perceive things. And that gives us a little bit of hope, because what we can say is it really is human craft and movement to reattune out of that, in a sense, even though it's not mechanical and immediate.
Cool. And so this kind of goes into my last question. You reference a lot of modern literature as well as movies. So that's a fun thing to talk about. Towards the end of your book, how are the 20th century authors, directors changing the way they write about nature and the scientific endeavor? How do these then begin influencing modern thought and the increasing viability of atheism?
Yeah, that's a cool question. So I'm trying to think here, writers and directors. So again, another instance where Lewis comes to the fore that is not in the book, because I hadn't read it by the time I wrote this book. But Lewis's space, well, we're not supposed to call it the space trilogy. We're supposed to call it the ransom trilogy, precisely because of the answer to this question. Lewis in that book makes this huge statement about how modern sci-fi literature, and one of the ways it's deeply impacted our imagination, is that it talks about space as opposed to the heavens. That what you see in the old view is that the heavens are full. To see the sky full of stars, and especially the light from the stars, creating a traffic jam of light signals, going all the way through the universe and all the way to me, is to actually look at a cathedral that is pulsing with life. And so in the medieval imagination, even if you're floating, as it were, out in space and there's nothing around you, you are still being penetrated by an infinite amount of light. And that is a fullness in the universe, you might say. Whereas even to speak about what we just said, space, this is what Lewis is trying to say. The very fact that we talk about this thing called space has deeply captured our imagination, such that what is reality like? Well, it's mostly empty, and it's occasionally punctuated by interesting things. And Lewis almost wants to reverse that. In the medieval conception, reality is just stuffed with being. And it's occasionally punctuated by things that are actually a little less alive than the angels, you might say. I think you see some reverse, you can see a kind of negative photocopy of Lewis, I think, in Cixin Liu's, have you guys read the Three Body Problem trilogy? This is an interesting modern sci-fi author, a Chinese author, just translated into English. Probably my favorite sci-fi. You could almost look at it as a kind of gosh, how would I summarize Cixin Liu? By the end, you're almost looking at kind of like a materialist Neoplatonism. It's weird. You can feel the longing for God to be part of the cosmic picture in Cixin Liu's sci-fi through the mouths of many of its characters, but it can't quite get over the way it imagines its own universe. And yet, when the book kind of goes on and it sort of explores what is actually possible, within the laws of physics and that sort of thing, it winds up being quite beautiful in some way. And I guess really that's all long-winded way of saying it feels it communicates attention in a way. The book is full of a universe that's full of meaning. It's very hard not to feel like there's something deeply beautiful and profound here, and yet it's also a universe that's just not, and dark in some way. In fact, very dark. And so I think he's an interesting author because it's in fact very hard to write sci-fi, I think, especially and to get that big cosmic scope and not elicit, Nick, and the word you brought up earlier, wonder. And it's very hard to have living wonder that doesn't terminate in something that's more than materialist, I think. Directors, this is where I always want to make a caveat here and say, cover your ears, Mom. People. So I want to mention up front, the directors I'm about to mention. It's going to have a lot to do with what your kind of viewing threshold is, and so I always want to flag that because I know people's consciences are different, and I don't want to, I'm not recommending that you watch these for Sunday school, okay? But I am really fascinated by the work of Robert Eggers and Ari Aster, two recent directors. Ari Aster did the films Hereditary and Midsommar. Mm-hmm. Robert Eggers has only made 3 films: The Witch, The Lighthouse. Maybe he made a 4th, but the most recent one is The Northman. If you guys saw that come out in the theaters, maybe this last year. They've only made a couple of films each. But I think they are both what unites Eggers' films. The Witch is literally the most sympathetic depiction of Puritanism in film you'll ever see. It's a horror film about the Puritans, kind of a Salem witch trials era. But what he's really trying to depict is a world where witches were real. And so the Puritans are teaching their kids the Westminster Confession. It looks at actually a very strict Puritan family who's been separated from the Puritans because they were too strict. But even the strictest of the Puritans, it treats with a fairly sympathetic gaze, and then tries to imagine what would it have been like really to be one of these guys and to live alone in a prairie right next to this weird thing called the forest. What did that actually feel like? And he really tries to seriously capture that. Likewise, in The Lighthouse, he tries to capture what does it feel like to have kind of the enchantment of the sea be real. And in The Northman, he's trying to capture, and in fact, he said this out loud as a director, and in The Northman, he's really trying to capture, imagine genuine pre-Christian pagan morals. Not just morals, but like a sense of being and existence and civilization. And he just depicts kind of a North Norseman sort of tribe in a very visceral, tangible way that gives a lot of texture to the world that makes sense of these social forms. And what he says, and Ari Aster is another one who I think is kind of looking at instances of, whereas Eggers is going to look at kind of previous peoples, or sort of what you might say are foreign peoples to us, and look at what were their worlds like. What Ari Aster does, on the other hand, is look at modern peoples who are suddenly put in little pagan pockets, paganisms in the modern world that are explicit alternatives, in a sense, even consciously in the films, to the late Christian world. And so I find those two guys fascinating because they seem to recognize there's something different about us. The fact that this pagan option in the modern world could be attractive, and the fact that we're fascinated by these peoples over here, and Eggers is more explicit about this. What's fascinating about it, he says, is I'm really trying to understand a world in which the significance was just so full and so immediate. It was so obvious. The rituals of life were so full of obvious already meaning, and we don't have that. And so depicting these peoples is just an interesting kind of gaze, a creative gaze in a sense. It's just a whole different way to be, you might say. And so in a sense, I think film and novels and those sorts of things are actually very helpful for us to more or less go on the imaginative journey. They're helpful catalysts to go on imaginative journey about what might be otherwise and how we might feel otherwise about the universe. And so those authors and those directors I found really fascinating on that score.
Yeah, so to end this out and talk about your conclusion, especially as you write on the difficulty of dealing with the perceived absence and the rise of the possibility of atheism. What I like is you don't like say, well, here's a better way, as if it's like kind of easy and obvious for us in the modern age. It's like, let's not, like, you don't have to go back to the Agrarian age. You don't have to go back to kind of pre-modern age to get it right. But you do help us, I think, and I love this, you help us better grapple with absence and presence. So can you describe how we might live, as you say, as we are, as classical confessional Protestants in this age, versus say, let's go back to this previous age that was better than ours?
Yeah, and I think, that's a great question. I really do think it comes down to, if it's unattunement, then I think what you said is just right. We don't go back. We don't move around the circumstances we're in. We move through them. You might call it a trial, a providential, historical trial of sorts, even though we don't need to be speculative and whatever. But, we could call it a kind of cultural trial, a sociological trial. We move through it. And I think what we're doing is just looking for healthy ways to reattune our sensibilities. And for us, for the time being especially, that's a fairly active thing. Just as, for instance, we might make a parallel here. In a world that's awash in something like pornography, say, the command "don't lust" is the same command as it always was. The project is the same as it always was. But in a context where pornography is so available and all over the place and that sort of thing, you actually have to be intentional. Well, not everybody, but many people have to be more intentional and strategic and kind of vigorous in the opposition to that than they might otherwise have to be. And I think this is fairly similar. There's all these forces that are going to tend to make it a bit tempting to think this way about the universe and about God and about people. And what we're doing is those we're consciously strategizing how to bring our will and our mind into conformity with each other. And really, a better way of saying that is we're strategizing ways for our the whole person, to be reattuned to reality. And I think, some of that is going to be like, we could talk about the tech-wise family, think about the way you use technology. We could say, hey, if you're able to do something that is meaningful to you. So I think a big thing actually in our civilization is that whole, well, I'd like to do that thing that's meaningful to me, but I can make more money over here, something like that. It might be that what is healthy for you and your family actually is, as long as you can provide for them, of course, but really is to do something that you find significant, if you can, that sort of thing. But, what I'm trying to do in the book is steelman all of that. What if that's impossible? Okay, you got to work at the place. You got to do this. There's very little you can do about many of the things, that create these pressures. You can only read so many apologetics books, that sort of thing. I do think the first path that we can all do is just a reattunement to persons. And I'd actually just leave it at that, a reattunement to persons. Man is the microcosm of the whole and the image of God. And I think if we can situate ourselves before persons in such a way that their agencies act upon us in such a way, and we're engaged in ourselves with them, we're kind of re-given an attunement in the most basic way to that dimension of existence, and are able perhaps to move through that to the whole. In a way, for the world, maybe what we've done is we've allowed the reality signals, the felt reality signals of the world, to shape the way in which we experience the signals of other people. And so people become just another piece of technology, almost an apparatus to be moved around, that sort of thing, a thing that is potentially in my way or not in my way. Whereas I think intentionally creating the posture where actually I'm wasting time with people. I'm just open, sold to people, to the human face. And this is Lewis, right? When Lewis talks about the most sacred thing you experience beside the Blessed Sacrament is your neighbor. I think maybe I end with that. I think that's actually how I end the book.
You
is
do
with
end
that
with
quote,
that, yep.
because that is really what I want people to linger on. Is and I think we're probably unaware just how much we struggle with that, and how much perhaps we think of people in instrumentalizing ways, and how that, I think, a deep reconnection to love and to the human face, in a sense, is in some ways kind of ground zero of the path to I don't like the word re-enchantment, but to reattunement, you might say. And then I will say, like, again, for me, it has been very, very helpful to go back to apologetics books. Your mind, reinforcing in your mind that this is true, is helpful to kind of keep you in the program when you're struggling with it on some other register. And so, for some people that is very helpful and useful, and I never want to denigrate that.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, and I love your section on dealing with what we think is absence and the blessedness of presence, where if you only have one or the other, it's you can't think of absence when there's no presence, and if all you ever have is absence. I forget how you put it in the book, but it was a great summary of dealing with some of these things, dealing with heartache, dealing with suffering, dealing with all this stuff.
I'm recalling now where your question is going. Right, there's a section, I think, toward the end, where I'm effectively saying, why would God do it? We do need to come up with the answer. Why would God do it this way? Why does he presumably could be clearer? Though some people argue that's not true. But let's say that's true. Let's say he could be clearer. It's nevertheless the case. Yeah. I try to argue what might God be doing kind of pedagogically and historically by not, he comes into the garden, it seems, and goes. There's this kind of up and down motion in the Garden of Eden, right? He walks, he goes. And then Jesus, even, I think one of the, Israel has all these hundreds of years of silence, and then God speaks. And one of the most fascinating things to me, even about Jesus, is how often Jesus is actually not disclosing himself. It's how often Jesus says, yeah, I could be clearer about this, but not yet. And that's a whole theme in Scripture. And so to me, that's part of a fuller exegesis of this kind of divine absence conundrum would factor that in. And what's God doing by posturing himself precisely where he does? How does that summon us to move toward him? Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, Dr. Minich, thank you so much for coming on, for writing this book, for all your work on this and your previous work and the stuff that you're working on right now. So, yeah, as we end out, if you want to plug your book that's upcoming and any final word for audience.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm really appreciative of this. And the other book is just kind of a guided tour of the Christian faith, hopefully a little simpler voiced than this one, because it's not a washed over dissertation. But hopefully that'll be out in the next year or two. We'll see. But yeah, this I'm really grateful for you plugging this and for reading it and engaging it, and especially for liking it. So thanks very much for having me on.
Totally. Of course, yeah. Like I said before, mark my words. This will be one of the award winners at the end of the year. So if you guys want to grab your copy, grab a Perspective award-winning, we'll call it the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude award-winning book. Who knows if that's actually going to end up in any award list. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, and we'll hopefully have you on again in the future.
Thanks so much, guys.
Of course.